Good morning. I hope that your Wednesday is off to a great start. I did have to pre-record this, so it's not actually Wednesday morning when I'm speaking to you, but it is when you're watching, and I do hope you're having a great day. So last week I looked at another Bible translation that I had on the shelf that I did not mention several years ago when I went through the veritable alphabet soup of Bible translations, and that was the Tanakh, the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh, in particular the 1999 edition of that. And today I'm looking at another translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament, if you're a Christian as you watch this. And what I'm going to look at today is a 3-volume translation done by one person, Robert Alter. He was for many years a professor of literature at University of California, Berkeley. He is a Jew and has studied Hebrew since he was just a young boy, and he spent 20 years of his life translating the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament, into English. Unlike the Tanakh that I referred to last week and most English translations, this is the work of one person. The vast majority of translations that you can pick up at a Christian bookstore or off Amazon or Christian book distributors, the vast majority of them are the work of a committee. In this case, this is the life's work, the magnum opus, if you will, of one person, and that is Robert Alter. It's 3 volumes, and here's what the first volume looks like. Unlike the Tanakh that I referred to last week, this will be a little easier for us primarily English speakers to approach, because it is printed and bound as an English book would be. So you open it with this is the beginning of the book rather than this. And of course it is written in English, and so you're reading from left to right as we customarily do. The one thing that will be unusual or unlike an English translation or most English translations is that the books are ordered in the traditional Hebrew canon. Torah, the first 5 books, then the prophets, in Hebrew the Nevi'im, and then the writings, again in Hebrew the Ketuvim. So, a little bit about this translation. First, these are heavily footnoted, which is why it is 3 bound volumes. They are heavily footnoted, like an English Study Bible. You've got some verses of biblical text at the top, and then a line below that you've got footnotes. But Alter's translation is different from an English Study Bible in this way. An English Study Bible, say if it's the New Living, the Life Application Study Bible, the footnotes in that would be geared towards how this passage applies to your life right now, or a devotional aspect to the footnotes. Other study Bibles, say like the ESV, English Standard Version Study Bible, the footnotes are primarily doctrinal. How do we understand this verse doctrinally? Not so much how do we apply it, as with Life Application Study Bible, but how do we interpret it? We're looking at it as from a doctrinal standpoint. In the case of his translation, the footnotes primarily deal with translation choices. Um, what is behind the Hebrew word that he translated in whatever way? So you are given an insight into his thought processes for translating this word this way or that word that way. Um, Alter's approach to translation is, I guess you could call it iconoclastic. Um, he he takes a rather dim view of an awful lot of modern translations. Um, he grants that modern scholarship excels in Hebrew or in Greek, as the case may be, but is very critical of how most modern translations actually go about expressing the Hebrew in English. Um, One person put it this way, that um, according to Alter, modern translations do a very good job at making Hebrew sound like English. But what Alter tries to do in his translation is he tries to make the English read like Hebrew, and there's a difference. Um, in my own opinion, in reading Alter, there are places where he he almost sounds like the King James, almost reads like King James, and in his view, the translators of the King James Bible, they they were lacking in knowledge of Hebrew. They they weren't as skilled in Hebrew. Their knowledge of the Hebrew language wasn't as great. I assume that their Hebrew manuscripts weren't as great as what we have now, but that those writers then did a better job with the English. So what he tries to do is he tries to um, convey Hebrew idiom, Hebrew phrasing, Hebrew poetry, etc., into English, so that when you read his English, you get a sense of how you get some sense of the Hebrew structure there. And this is admittedly very difficult to do because the languages are very, very different. Um, there's no such thing as a word for word translation or an exactly literal translation because languages work differently. They have different, they have, in a lot of cases, different word orders, different verbal systems, and all of the rest. But given all of that, he does his best to convey the Hebrew into English and make the English actually reflect Hebrew. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. In a sense, Alter is being very literal with the text. In a sense, he's being very literal with the text in terms of he's really intentionally trying to convey um, some sense of the Hebrew structure, some sense of the Hebrew language into English. And Hebrew has some idiosyncrasies. Hebrew is a very graphic language. It's earthy language. Um, there are a lot of ways that Hebrew expresses things that are solid, earthy, graphic. Whereas in English we might do something differently. In times in the Old Testament, in Hebrew you might say a phrase like um, "away from the face of," and it gets translated "behind." because that's what it really means. So that's what I mean by Hebrew just works differently. And Alter tries to give us a sense of that. Um, some things to point out. Um, Alter is a Jew, so he does not translate from a Christian point of view. So just take that going in. He doesn't translate it. There are some things he does not translate as a Christian would. A great example of that is in Daniel chapter 7. It's a rather famous passage where in normal Christian Bibles, English translations in Christian Bibles, it will say, "One like the Son of Man approached the Ancient of Days." And the phrase "Son of Man" that's pretty literally what the Hebrew says, being Adam. But Alter doesn't translate it that way. he refers to one like a human being. And the reason, and he intentionally doesn't translate it literally because in his notes he says that term "Son of Man," it's a loaded term for Christians, carries an awful lot of freight and weight for a Christian audience, and he's not trying to give a Christian interpretation. He takes a rather dim view of the traditional Christian interpretation of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, a very famous servant passage, the suffering servant, if you will. Typically, as Christians, we read that and we see Jesus in that. When I read Isaiah 53, I see Jesus because I'm a Christian. Alter, as a Jew, doesn't read it that way, and he doesn't translate it that way. So just things to understand and things to know as you're going into it. And like I said, in some respects, he is, I think, perhaps closer to the King James. Not that he will sound exactly like King James, but there are here and there and when you're reading him, oh, that sounds a little like the King James. And I think that's because he does not follow the King James, use that as a starting point, but he shares a love for and a passion for poetry and beauty and elegance. So what I want to do is read a little bit. There's some passages to give you a flavor of how Alter handles things. First is this. I'm going to read the first few verses of Isaiah chapter 40 from the Tanakh, and then I'll read the same first few verses from Alter's translation. This is from the Tanakh. A voice rings out, "Proclaim." Another asks, "What shall I proclaim?" All flesh is grass, all its goodness like flowers of the field. Grass withers, flowers fade, when the breath of the Lord blows on them. Indeed, man is but grass. Grass withers, flowers fade, but the word of our God is always fulfilled. Alter does it this way. A voice calls out, saying, "Call." And I said, "What shall I call?" All flesh is grass, and all its trust like the flowers of the field. Grass dries up, the flower fades, for the Lord's wind has blown upon it. The people indeed is grass. Grass dries up, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord is forever. Reads differently. This is this reads a little more like poetry. Um, the last verse from the Tanakh, but the word of our God is always fulfilled, just sort of seems flat. Unlike the word of the Lord is forever. One just seems flat compared to the other. And just to give you a sense from another 3 examples, here's how Alter translates the first couple of verses of Genesis. When God began to create heaven and the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness, etc., etc. I like that phrase in there. And the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, God's breath hovering over the waters. A couple of Psalms, the same 2 Psalms that I referred to yesterday or last week, Psalm 23 and Psalm 100. Psalm 23 in Alter's translation. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In grass meadows he makes me lie down, by quiet waters guides me. My life he brings back, he leads me on pathways of justice for his name's sake. Though I walk in the vale of death's shadow, I fear no harm, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, it is they that console me. You set out a table before me in the face of my foes. You moisten my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Let but goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many long days. Again, to me, that's a beautiful rendition of it. The King James is famous for, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." His translation there, "Though I walk in the vale of death's shadow," harkens back to the King James and is actually a pretty literal translation of the Hebrew word there, which is Salmaveth, meaning death's shadow. And then Psalm 100. Another psalm that some of us probably learned to memorized when we were just kids. Shout to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord in rejoicing. Come before him in glad song. Know that the Lord is God. He has made us, and we are his people in the flock of his tents. Come into his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts in praise. Acclaim him. Bless his name, for the Lord is good. Forever his kindness, and for all his generations his faithfulness. So that is sort of an introduction, if you will, to Robert Alter's the Hebrew Bible. It's in 3. You buy that in 3 volumes. I looked at it on Amazon, and it's about $75 on Amazon. If you want to get it, it's probably not, for us as a Christian, it's probably not the first translation you should use for the Old Testament. Whatever your go-to translation, ESV, NIV, New Revised Standard Version, New American Standard, etc., etc. Keep that. But this is a good way, a good resource to look at. Look at this perhaps as a secondary resource. You're studying whatever Old Testament passage, and I want to get another take on this, and you pull out Alter for that. It's excellent for that purpose. With that as an introduction to Robert Alter's The Hebrew Bible, have a great rest of your day. And as always, the most important thing about any translation of the Bible isn't exactly what translation it is. The most important thing is that you read it.